New photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate released by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee. We have just a portion of the 95,000 total images, which features some high-profile people, including a photo of President Trump surrounded by unidentified females. The redactions you see in this photo were done by the Democrats on the committee. Others featured in the images include former President Bill Clinton, former Trump chief strategist Steve Bannon, Microsoft founder Bill Gates, film director Woody Allen, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. All of these men have denied any wrongdoing, and to be clear, none of these photos is evidence of any wrongdoing, and we do not know when they were taken or know the context around the events and people they depict. The White House has responded to the images, accusing House Democrats of, quote, selectively releasing cherry-picked photos with random redactions to try and create a false narrative. And last night, President Trump dismissed the importance of the release of the photos.
Well, I haven't seen it, but I mean, everybody knew this man. He was all over Palm Beach. He has photos with everybody. I mean, almost, there are hundreds and hundreds of people that have photos with him, so that's no big deal. I know nothing about it.
Tonight, a new batch of images is reopening one of the most controversial questions in American public life. How did Jeffrey Epstein get so close to so many powerful people, and who actually knew what when it mattered most? Because what just dropped isn't a rumor, and it isn't a single blurry screenshot. It's a fresh release of photographs said to come from Epstein's estate, images that show him circulating around wealthy and influential circles, and images that lawmakers are now using as a pressure point in a fight over what the government still hasn't fully disclosed. Now, before we go any further, one thing has to be said clearly and upfront. A photo can show proximity, not guilt. A photo can show access, not intent. And a photo, especially one released without context, can raise questions without answering them. Many people who have been publicly linked to Epstein over the years have denied wrongdoing, and those denials matter. At the same time, the public's demand for transparency is not going away because Epstein's story is not just about one man. It's about a network, a system of influence, and the way power can bend accountability. So here's what happened. On Friday, Democratic members connected to the House Oversight Committee released a selection of photographs they say were provided from Epstein's estate as part of a much larger trove, tens of thousands of images. In the initial release, there were dozens, and later more were posted. The images include Epstein pictured with various well-known figures across politics, business, and culture. Some images show interiors of properties and other scenes that lawmakers described as disturbing. The photographs were released without captions, without dates, and without verified timelines attached for the public to immediately understand what each image represents. And that detail, no context, is where the story gets intense. Because when images are dropped into the public square like this, they don't land like evidence in a courtroom. They land like sparks on dry grass. If you're watching this right now, I want you to think about your first reaction. Did you immediately assume the worst? Did you immediately dismiss it as political theater? Or did you pause and ask the hard question that almost nobody asks anymore? What do we actually know, and what do we only think we know? Drop a comment with one word that describes your reaction: shocked, skeptical, angry, numb, or curious. I'm reading them because that reaction tells us something about where America is right now, how much trust we've lost, and how fast we fill in blanks when we feel the system woe. Now, the reason this release matters is not just the names involved. It's the timing. For years, the phrase Epstein Files has lived in the public imagination as a symbol of hidden truth, documents and material that people believe could reveal the full scope of who surrounded Epstein, who enabled him, and who may have escaped scrutiny. But at the same time, there's a real-world ethical line here: survivors' privacy. The public has a right to answers, but victims have a right not to be exposed, identified, or turned into collateral damage in a political war. And according to reporting, that's why some faces in the released images were redacted. Lawmakers have said they're trying to prevent harm to victims and protect identities. That's an important point because the moment survivors become props, we all lose. But here's the tension: redactions also fuel suspicion. People see black boxes and they wonder what's behind them. They see missing context and they assume the worst-case scenario. And into that space rushes misinformation, conspiracy content, and outrage entrepreneurs who don't care about truth, only clicks. So if you want to understand what's happening, you have to understand the battlefield. On one side, Democrats involved in the release argue that putting images into public view pressures the government and the White House to stop delaying and disclose more material. They argue that the public deserves the full picture and that transparency is a form of justice. On the other side, the White House and Republicans argue the release is selective, that it's designed to create a narrative, and that it's political manipulation rather than responsible disclosure. They say images without context can mislead people, and that no wrongdoing is shown just because someone appears in a photo. And here's the part that makes this feel like a true newsroom moment. Both sides are telling you they're protecting the public from deception. So the question becomes, who is actually helping you get closer to the truth? Let's slow it down and let's do what cable news often doesn't. We're going to separate three things: what is known, what is alleged, and what is unknown. What is known is the basic timeline of the Epstein case. Epstein was arrested again in 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, and he died in jail that same year before trial. His longtime associate Ghislaine Maxwell was later convicted for her role in recruiting and grooming underage girls, and she is serving a lengthy prison sentence. That's the core legal reality. What is also known is that Epstein moved through elite spaces for years, hosting, networking, donating, socializing, building relationships that gave him prestige and protection. That is not speculation. That is the pattern that has been described again and again, and it's why the public still cares. Because the fear is simple. If a man like that could move that freely, what did powerful people ignore and what did they benefit from? But what is unknown in many cases is the context of each specific relationship. Were certain people casual acquaintances? Were they business contacts? Were they social friends? Did they ever visit properties? Did they ever travel? Did they ever know about crimes? Did they ever hear rumors? Did they ever suspect something and look away? Those are not questions a photo alone can answer. A photo is a starting point, not a verdict. So when lawmakers release images like these, the responsible next step is not to jump to conclusions. The responsible next step is to demand the missing pieces: dates, metadata, accompanying records, chain of custody, and cross-reference documentation. In other words, verification. Here's the framework investigators use, and you should use it too. They ask, when was the image taken? Where was it taken? Who captured it? Was it staged? Was it part of an event? Who else was there? What communications happened around that time? Were there calendars, flight logs, emails, texts, or visitor records that align with it? And then the biggest question of all, did anything in the verified record suggest knowledge, participation, or cover-up of criminal activity? That's the line. Now let me ask you something, and I want a real answer in the comments. Do you think Congress should release everything they have with victim identities protected, even if it embarrasses public figures? Or do you think selective releases are too dangerous because they can distort reality and turn the public into a jury without evidence? Tell me where you land, because your answer reveals what you value more right now: speed or accuracy, exposure or caution, accountability or restraint. And as you think about that, understand why this story keeps resurfacing. It's not just about Epstein. It's about what Epstein represents, a test of whether power can be held accountable in America. Because if you believe the system works, you expect full disclosure to happen through courts, investigators, and formal processes. But if you believe the system protects the powerful, then every delay feels like proof of a cover-up. And that's why this release hits so hard. It lands directly on the country's trust wound. Now here's what we're watching next. There's growing anticipation around what additional government material may be disclosed, what may be unsealed, and what may be released under political and legal pressure. And every time a new tranche appears, photos, emails, documents, it triggers the same cycle: outrage, denial, speculation, and then silence. But this time, the silence may not last, because lawmakers are signaling that more releases could come. And because the public attention is now so intense that institutions are being forced to respond, even if they hate the spotlight. So in a moment, we're going to walk through the real stakes: what a photo dump does to public trust, how misinformation spreads inside the gaps, and what truth actually looks like in a case where the facts are buried under politics, legal restrictions, and years of public suspicion. And I'm going to tell you something else too, something that will make some people uncomfortable. The most dangerous part of this story is not only the possibility of hidden crimes. The most dangerous part is what happens when Americans decide the truth is unknowable. Because when people stop believing in evidence, the loudest voice wins. And the loudest voice is not always the honest one. So stay with me, because after the break in this story, after the headlines and the names, the real question is this: if the system finally opens the files, will it bring clarity, or will it tear the country into even more pieces? If you're still here, you're not just watching a scandal, you're watching a collision between truth, power, and the public's patience. Because the moment photos like these are released without context, America does what it always does now: we split into tribes and we race to conclusions that confirm what we already believed. Some people look at any Epstein photo and say, there it is, proof. Others look at the same photo and say, there it is, a setup. And both reactions can be wrong at the same time. So let's talk about what this really is: a transparency war. One side says, we're releasing what we can to force disclosure. The other side says, you're weaponizing fragments to smear people. And while they fight, the public is left holding a puzzle with half the pieces missing and being told to guess the picture anyway. That's not how justice works. That's not how journalism works. And that's not how a healthy country works. So tonight, let's do the harder thing. Let's talk about standards. Here's the standard that matters: evidence is contextual. If you want to evaluate the meaning of an image, you need supporting documentation. Otherwise, you're not investigating, you're interpreting, and interpretation is where manipulation lives. Think about it. If a committee releases an image of a politician standing near Epstein at a social event, what could it mean? It could mean they met once at a crowded gathering. It could mean they were socially connected. It could mean they were part of the same network. It could mean nothing more than a camera captured a moment. Or it could be something darker, but you can't responsibly claim that without substantiation. Now that doesn't let anyone off the hook morally, because there's a separate question from criminal guilt, and it's a question Americans are asking more than ever. Why were so many smart, powerful people around this man at all? Why did doors open for him? Why did people treat him like a VIP? Why did warnings not stop him sooner? Those are questions of judgment, culture, and incentives. They matter. And they're fair. If you had a friend who later turned out to be a monster, people would ask, how didn't you see it? Now expand that to presidents, billionaires, celebrities, and elite institutions, and you see why this story never dies, because the public isn't only looking for a list of names. The public is looking for an explanation. So let's talk about the two outcomes America keeps hoping for and keeps fearing. Outcome one is clarity, real clarity. That would look like verified releases, documents with dates, full context, redactions that protect victims but don't erase accountability, and a clear explanation of what is being withheld and why. It would include things like official logs, corroborated communications, sworn testimony, court filings, investigative summaries, material that can be checked, challenged, and understood. Outcome two is chaos. That would look like selective leaks, partial releases, and viral gotcha drops where the public becomes addicted to shock but never gets the full truth. And the longer that goes on, the more the country trains itself to believe that truth is just whichever side posts the most convincing clip. That's not transparency. That's psychological warfare. Now here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The Epstein story is a magnet for misinformation because it sits at the intersection of three things: real crimes, powerful people, and institutional secrecy. Real crimes create real anger, powerful people create real suspicion. Institutional secrecy creates real gaps, and gaps get filled. If you want to understand why this story keeps exploding online, it's because the human brain hates uncertainty. When we don't know, we invent. So I want to ask you something personal. When you see a headline like "New EPSTIN photos include many powerful FIGURES," what do you do first? Do you search for the original source, or do you watch someone react to it? Do you look for context, or do you look for confirmation? Be honest in the comments, because this is how information spreads now, not through facts first, through feelings first. And that brings us to the political reality. In Washington, this isn't just about what's in the files. It's about who controls the story. If you can force the other side to answer questions on your timeline, you gain leverage. If you can imply a connection, you don't have to prove it to win the news cycle. If you can frame the release as transparency, you look like the hero. If you can frame the release as smear tactics, you look like the victim. And the public is stuck watching two PR machines argue over who loves truth more. So where does that leave the viewer? It leaves you with a responsibility that feels unfair, but it's real. You have to demand both transparency and standards. Because yes, the public deserves answers about how Epstein operated, who enabled him, and what institutions failed. But no, America cannot survive if we turn accusation into entertainment and call it justice. Now let's talk about the survivors, because this part is sacred and it often gets lost. Epstein's victims were not headlines. They were young people whose lives were shaped by exploitation and betrayal. Every time the story goes viral, there's a risk that their pain becomes background noise. So here's a question for you, one that cuts through politics. What would justice actually look like here? Would it be the full release of records with strong protections for victims? Would it be stronger laws to prevent trafficking and grooming networks? Would it be institutional accountability, people losing positions, not just reputations? Would it be funding and support for survivors, not just outrage on social media? Tell me what you think justice is. Not what sounds good on TV, what you believe would actually matter. Because if the entire country is going to demand transparency, then the country also has to demand that survivors are protected, respected, and prioritized. Now here's what we're going to watch next, and this is where the suspense becomes real. When releases accelerate photos, emails, court materials, two things happen at the same time. First, more information can bring real clarity. Second, more information can also be weaponized faster than anyone can fact-check it. So the next phase of this story won't just be about what gets released. It will be about how America reacts to what gets released. Will we wait for verification, or will we rush to judgment? Will we protect the innocent, or will we treat association as guilt? Will we protect victims, or will we demand spectacle? Because if we choose spectacle, then the powerful win twice. First, by escaping accountability when it mattered, and second, by watching the public destroy itself trying to guess the truth. And that's why this moment matters. Not because a photo exists, but because what we do with it decides what kind of country we are. So here's my final question tonight, and I want you to answer it like you mean it. If the full Epstein-related material is released, do you think it will finally close this chapter, or will it open an even darker one? Comment your answer and tell me why. And if you stayed to the end, you already understand the bigger story. This isn't just about Epstein. It's about whether power can be questioned, whether institutions can be trusted, and whether the public can demand truth without becoming the weapon.